Today we will be finishing up administrative materials and as a consequence finishing up primary sources. And then we will begin practice materials. And I will explain why practice materials come back again after we finish primary resources. We will finish up the workshop from last week and move on to a workshop this week as well. Okay, so as they say on Homeland and lots of other good TV shows, previously on our show, we were looking at federal administrative materials, essentially the executive branch, or administrative, as it is known. That's why it's called administrative materials. And we talked about delegation. Remember, we looked at our kind of funky fun, I hope, Ben's guide, where we started with the delegation of law, so Congress, or delegation of authority, Congress delegated to the various agencies. And then we talked a little bit about the regulatory process, which is in this cute little handout here, talking about once that authority is delegated, then the agencies start to promulgate regulations according to the Administrative Procedure Act, and the federal end, and actually the state Administrative Procedure Acts. They wind up first in the Federal Register, published daily, and then in a process I hope we are now very familiar with, the magic of codification. Remember, codification equals the force, and it gets transferred in subject arrangement to the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. So, finding regulations, pretty much all the methods we have been talking about. So, of course, keyword searching, but the problem with keyword searching in regulations is that the terminology is even more specialized and specific than in statutes. And even in statutes, they're pretty specific. So we want to make sure to look at the table of contents. Probably when looking at regulatory material, this is even more important, and it's pretty darn important with regard to statutory materials as well as secondary sources. But here again, because that specialized terminology is so difficult to identify, looking at the table of contents is going to be really important. So, for instance, if we were able to identify that section 2590.731 was of relevance, we might want to take a look and see, going sort of up the hierarchy, and might want to take a look at sort of the highest level that's going to be relevant, particularly relevant to our issues. So employee benefits, security administration, and we would see these various subchapters that we looked at last time and discovered there were definitions that were interesting. There are a whole lot of other sections that were of interest. So keyword searching, table of contents, one method. Another method, our BFF, our very best friend, this annotated code, annotated statutory code. If we are lucky, and that's a big if with the annotated statutory code, because sometimes you just will not find regulatory references. Even more true in the state end, which we'll talk about shortly, but if you notice, we are looking at good old USCA, but it's not good old 1144. It's not quite as good old, well, it is actually good, but it's not quite as old 1132. And I chose that because I knew I could look at citing references, and I would find something, regulations. The problem with these citing references, regulatory references, is that they are hit or miss. Sometimes they get you into the right title and maybe even part number. Remember the CFR, let's go back to our table of contents for the moment. Remember the CFR is divided up into parts. So we're looking at the Title 29, these chapters, and within Chapter 25, if we have the subchapters, and then within whatever relevant subchapter, we would have a part. So you want to remember that terminology, because when you when people talk about the CFR, they frequently refer to a part. A part is just a series of relevant sections. So hopefully, if you're lucky, going back to our statutory code, our citing references will get us to the right part. At least maybe will get us to the right title. So here we've got Title 29, 1850, Provisions, Disclosure, Discovery. We're not quite worried about that yet. So I might continue to look and see, oh look, Title 29, Part 2520. And when I start to see, and this is a general research technique, honestly, for any kind of research, but legal research especially, so within all of our sources, when I start to see something, a bunch of different references that are related, that seem to be relevant, I mean, if they're totally irrelevant, then that's a waste. But okay, so here's one, 2520, here's 2520 again. So I'm probably going to take a look at 2520, and because I understand how the CFR is organized by part, I know that when I see the section number, part 2520 is telling me that it's part 2520, and then point something. So again, I would look at my table of contents, and just click on that one. So my reference from our BFF. And I am definitely going to look at Part 2520. I'm going to look at the other sections within Part 2520, and then I might work my way up the table of contents to see what else I find relevant. I know I went over this in depth last time, but I think it's worth going over again because it's so important. Okay. By way of review, to get back to our section, we talked about the authority and source, or on Lexis it's called history. It's called source in the print CFR itself, and actually Westlaw will refer to it as source as well. So statutory authority, that whole delegation process we were just reviewing, that delegation happens in a statute, so that statutory authority is where you will find that. The history or source is where your regulation was promulgated and where you'll find that original promulgation in the Federal Register. Remember the daily publication. And that's important because, anybody remember? Or useful because, that's important. Why do I care? Why do you care about the Federal Register? In addition to the final regulation, do you remember what else might be in there?
Maybe commentary.
Commentary that will tell us what?
Oh, like legislative intent.
Regulatory intent, absolutely. You can call it legislative. Well, you probably shouldn't call it legislative because it's regulatory, but that same exact concept just moved over to the regulatory side. So if you need to understand why did these regulators choose this particular language, you want to find that source and go into the Federal Register. Okay. Another aspect you want to remember, in addition to the regulations, are administrative decisions and guidance. Really, the best place to find them for federal is that Virginia website we talked about. Yes, it's right there. As well as a good old Google search. We talked a lot about using the site search, SITE that is. Another way on Westlaw, again, is our citing references. Notice, in addition to regulations, there's some references to administrative decisions and guidance. And last but certainly not least, again, our keyword search and our good old filters on the side. Okay. And of course, the nice thing about looking at the CFR on Lexis Westlaw is that they will update for us. Anybody remember the free place to update the CFR? ECFR. You can just Google ECFR, and it's only a few days old. And you will see the importance of updating. Remember, we saw this in Lexis, and interestingly, it's not in Westlaw. This document is current through March 27th, so hey, that's pretty current, right? Pursuant to 82 Federal Register 8346, regulatory freeze pending review. Certain regulations will be delayed pending further review. See publisher's note. And we noted, okay, that's probably something we need to investigate further, because we don't know if that means we have to do something further to update. So we would want to look at that Federal Register, and what we would discover is that that is referring to a presidential document. So this is how I am transitioning from federal regulatory materials to presidential materials. So, of course, the president is part of the executive branch, and he's in charge of the entire executive branch, which means that the president administers the agencies and directs the agencies on how to conduct their daily business, as well as the actual office of the president. And we've actually already encountered one presidential document. Anybody remember which presidential document? Our hero, the bill, went through the entire legislative process and wound up where? When he finally becomes a law, what happens to him? Or her? He looked like a he on the cartoon, but anyway. His head got signed by the president. And what happens, not outside of the cartoon, in addition to the bill getting signed on his forehead, her forehead, the president might issue a presidential signing statement. So that is one thing we will find in the compilation of presidential documents. And here we are at GovInfo. And here is the compilation of presidential documents on GovInfo. And we are looking at last month of this year. You can actually, if I scroll down, you see there's some for March in there already. And what are presidential documents? Well, we have addresses and remarks. We have proclamations. These proclamations tend to be proclamations of declaring a day, a month, naming post offices. So they're, I won't say they're not serious, but they're nothing that they're typically not something that's going to require you to find out about for a particular legal issue. I mean, I suppose there might be some example that of that. More addresses and remarks, executive orders. And we'll be talking more about executive orders. How many of you have been noticing that we're hearing a little bit about executive orders in the news these days, right? Okay, so we'll take a look at a couple of those. So we've got executive orders, we've got remarks, we've got signing statements, letters and messages, addresses and remarks, and eventually more statements, and if we scroll down in here somewhere or other, we will also find memoranda. So obviously the compilation of presidential documents compiles these various presidential documents. So that's the official place to find presidential documents. But more likely, if you were to Google immigration executive order, which is probably one of the ones that we're more interested in these days, you might wind up at the White House webpage. And here, I like this because it gives us a good idea of the main presidential actions. So executive orders, memoranda, those proclamations, and then Office of Management and Budget is OMB material. So this is today. So we actually, well, you see this is from yesterday. The executive order that just got issued today obviously isn't up here yet, but I bet you it will be by tomorrow. So we see the various executive orders that the president has been issuing in the last several days, and obviously you can scroll back to the beginning of the term, presidential term. Let's take a more specific look. So remember on Lexis, we talked about this regulatory freeze pending review. And as I mentioned, that was my segue into presidential documents. So here is that memoranda for heads of executive departments and agencies. That's the one I want. So here's implementation of regulatory freeze. That other thing I was showing you is just a letter from the White House Chief of Staff explaining what we're looking at now. So we're looking at the memorandum implementation of regulatory freeze, just like we saw on the CFR section. And we find out that this freeze is instructing departments and agencies with respect to regulations that have been published in the Federal Register but have not yet taken effect. Okay, so we now have learned our particular regulation is already in effect. So we have now done our updating requirements. So we know that what we're looking at is up to date, but anything that, remember, regulations, just like statutes, have effective dates. So if its effective date was after the date of this, so after January 20th, then this freeze, and we'd have to read this memoranda as well as the explanatory letter that I just had up to find out exactly how that might affect whatever pending regulation we were interested in. So that's an example of the practical effect of some of these presidential materials. Of course, these presidential materials have very practical effect. We've all been reading in the news these days. And those are the executive orders regarding immigration. So here is the more recent one that was issued earlier this month. I'm sure you remember there was one issued, I think it was toward the end of January, and that one was put on hold by the courts, and now this one has been challenged in the courts and also put on hold. But here you would see the exact language, and the language that those people who are questioning this in court are looking at and determining, they're making constitutional arguments, right, as to whether or not this is a valid exercise of presidential authority, whether it's constitutional, actually. So this brings up the question, how does one determine if an executive order is still valid? Right, because we have a president from a different party taking over in January from the president who was president last year, right? So probably there's going to be a change in policy, right? So probably the president taking over now might not like some of the executive orders that the last president did. And that tends to happen whenever there is a change of party in the White House. So there is something called the executive order disposition table. Imagine that. Just when you think you have a question and there's something to solve the problem. Now, I have to say, solve the problem, it doesn't exactly solve the problem, because as we will see, the executive orders of President Trump that have been stayed by the courts, this table will not tell you that. I'm actually very curious what happens to it. So if I can remember over the course of time, I'm going to come back to this just to see if how, if at all, they reflect that. Even the first one, the first executive order on immigration, that probably now is no longer going to be at issue because the second one superseded it essentially. Well, I don't know that for a fact, but I'm guessing that's what's going to happen. They haven't reflected that yet. But this is where you would go at least to get a start. So we can see here we've got the executive orders listed for the recent presidents. There's actually another disposition table at the National Archives site. If you Google executive order disposition table, you'll get links to both. You just want to be bibliographically aware of what you're looking at to know, do I need executive orders from a recent president or a president from further back in time? So here we can just take a look at what's happened to those executive orders. So here's the ones under President Trump, and as we'll see this, so this is the executive order at issue, and it doesn't really tell us very much. And I think it was yesterday I took a look at the other one and didn't see anything. If I can, yeah, see here's it's even by the same name, and they don't show anything. And by anything, what I mean, so I'm going to look at a couple of President Obama's executive orders so you can see when the disposition table actually tells us something happens. So you can see here, and this is way back from 2009, so this is from when President Obama first took over office from President George W. Bush. So here's an amendment to a really old executive order back in 1983. What also might happen is supersedes. So I imagine that's what's going to happen to the first immigration executive order of President Trump, given that the second one sort of took over, but I don't know that for sure. And executive orders can terminate and make life a little easy here. They can also revoke or be revoked by. So probably the answer to how can you tell if an executive order is still in effect, this would be the first place I would look. I would then want to look at the Federal Register and the text of the executive orders. These executive orders, like other administrative material, first get published in the Federal Register. So there's no easy answer to how you tell for sure, because this dispossession table, as we can see, isn't exactly up to date. But this isn't a question that comes up that frequently. What's going on now with these immigration executive orders and the being challenged in court is fairly unusual. It's not unheard of. I think some of President Obama's executive orders also were questioned and put on hold. I think actually his relating to immigration last year were also challenged in court and stayed. The effect was stayed, or implementation, excuse me, was stayed. So here again, sometimes the answer is you just gotta read the news. Any questions on executive materials? Okay, let's then move on to state materials. Oh, let's go back before we jump into New York. Let's put our state administrative materials in context, and context, of course, is our favorite handout, our sources handout. And the reason I think it should be our favorite handout is it pretty much lets us know, once we understand what's going on in the federal realm, that we really kind of understand, not kind of, we really actually understand what's going on in the state jurisdiction. And at least with regard to administrative regulatory materials, some of the names are even the same, not all. I joke about how chapter laws, the names have been changed, the state session laws, the names have been changed from federal, so public law, they're called public laws in federal, and there are all sorts of different names in states. Well, in state, most of the time, the equivalent, at least on the chronological initial publication, it's going to be called a register. I haven't looked at all 50 states and jurisdiction and other jurisdictions to promise you every single time it's going to be called a register, but most of the time it is. So we have the Federal Register, Federal Administrative Daily or chronological publication, and we have the New York State Register, or the New York State chronological publication. And I corrected myself from daily to say chronological because states don't necessarily publish their registers daily. Here in New York, they're published weekly. And again, it works the same way. So the magic of codification, the force is applied, and our final in-force regulations are published for the federal realm in the Code of Federal Regulations, federal jurisdiction. And same thing, state. The final in-force regulations are published in the, now it's not quite the same name here, Official Compilation of Code Rules and Regulations of the State of New York. And I won't expect anybody to remember that name or even say it. But do remember, please, NYCRR, and remember NYC is not New York City. And remember also when you see administrative code, that's not the same as statutory code. And we now know why. So for now on, I will call it the NYCRR because the full name is just too long to say. But here's what it looks like in print. So you can see the whole full name there. And now one thing we will have noticed about the federal code is that, well, we actually may not have noticed. If you look at the CFR, GovInfo, or in print, you will notice it is not annotated. It is not our BFF. As you look at the NYCRR in print, as it goes around, you'll notice no annotations. Lexis and Westlaw provide for us the ability to annotate it in a way, either by just adding that information for us. This is one reason why we pay 5 figures for these services. So we would see case notes if there were any for this section. There aren't here on Lexis. Or we could shepherdize. Likewise on Westlaw. Again, we're still in the CFR. We have citing references. If there are any notes of decisions, they would be there. Also true for New York regulations. Let's see if I have one up here. This is the problem with having too many tabs. I think I just passed by it, so you know what? I'm just going to type it in again. Bear with me a moment. So the example I will be using, and you'll understand why in a while. CRR. And as with most things with regard to the states, there tends to be less material associated. By material, I mean fewer. You're less likely to find cases that cite any particular state regulation, just as you found there were fewer citations to state statutes. So here we can see Westlaw doesn't have any notes of decisions, but it has a handful of citing references. And likewise, if we were to pull this up on Lexis, we probably wouldn't see any notes of decisions, but we would be able to shepherdize. And the nice thing about shepherdize,ing as well as using the citing references, is in addition to seeing cases that cite to the regulation, we could see secondary sources that help explain it. So again, all of these concepts that we've been talking about all along apply once again with administrative materials. So as I said, back when looking at our sources handout, we really already know most of this already with regard to executive materials for the state. Okay. So let's go back to that state regulation. Now this is pretty random. This has nothing to do with liability of HMO, as you can see. It has to do with equine drug thresholds. And the reason I bring this up is that this is a true story from a couple of months ago. So this is a recent true story. I'm at the reference desk and in comes an attorney who needs some help. He is trying to find the regulation from 2014 having to do with the acceptable amounts of a particular kind of drug. And it's in it's in this list here, and you see all sorts of drugs here that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. And he was interested in one of these because he had a client who was given a citation and a fine for having too high an amount of one of these. Oh, here it is, Furo. Like I said, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. If any of you are horse people, please chime in. But anyway, so his client was found, horse breeder was found to have too much of this particular drug in whatever test was run by the state agency. This was back in September of 2014, and the attorney, to his credit, was wondering, okay, this is 2017, I wonder what the loss, I want to make sure that it was the same amount in 2014 to make sure that this fine was indeed legitimately assessed. So we took a look at the 2014 code, and by the way, the archived administrative codes are online as well as the archived statutory codes. And by archived, I mean older ones. So we went back to the New York Code, and it's on Westlaw as well as that was in 2014, and took a look, and we couldn't even find this section, 4043.3 of Title 9 of the New York Administrative Code. So the first thing I did is I thought, where did this section come from? Maybe it just was a different number, right? The sections get renumbered all the time. So I looked at our credit and I said to myself, so this was first filed in June 4, 1982, semicolon, and amended by this September 3rd, 1992, and amended by, semicolon, emergency rulemaking. So here we're getting into the relevant time period. So emergency rulemaking effective July 9th, 2013. Oops. And amended by, in that it was expired, and then amended. So I'm following this through. I'm not going to read it all for you, but what I see is September 2013, renumbered to 4043.13. Aha! And new 4043 adopted December 16, 2014. Well, this all happened September 2014, so this new one doesn't apply. So I need to go track down that. And as it turned out, because we have all these emergency rulemakings, we wound up having to go back to the source. Now, it doesn't give you per state, not all state codes tell you the source, but if you have the date, you can then go back into the register for that date and then look and see if you can find your section. So we looked to see if we could find that section, and through a fair amount of work, I'll have to say, we finally tracked down that the emergency rulemaking that was in effect for September 2014, we already know that this section didn't exist. The section that did exist that addressed this particular topic never mentioned that particular drug. So using just all these legal research skills that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, this attorney was able to determine that that fine probably was not legitimately assessed by the regulatory agency because the section that they were relying on didn't exist. So that's why we're looking at this section. So again, to bring hopefully a little bit of the real world in and why this might actually matter. Why you might actually care. Okay, so on a larger sense, in looking at this material, again, finding New York regulations, same strategies we've already talked about. You will also find administrative New York and other states on the web. So use your favorite portal, FindLaw, Legal Information Institute, Google works too. And see what you find with regard to your state government. So you want a .gov. And in New York, they have what I think is kind of a funky organization. You have to know to scroll down and find the agencies here. And what I would have discovered if I wanted to do more research into the agency that issued our section regarding drugs and horses, is I would discover that this is the New York State Gaming Commission. So, in finding the Gaming Commission, again, Google is fine, or there we go. So finding the Gaming Commission, Google is fine, or navigating through the state website. Here's the Gaming Commission, so I might look up horse racing, and what these state as well as federal agency websites will tell you is what's going on today. So I hopefully will, now that I've discovered for the, or this attorney discovered for this client that the client may not have to pay the fee. Hopefully this is now a continuing client. So you may want to know what's going on in the horse racing and regulatory environments. So here are meetings you can find out about. This is where I would go to look to see if there are any administrative decisions. Remember, we want to look out for guidance. Probably the Gaming Commission doesn't have an administrative law judge. I don't know how many disputes would be brought before the commission, but I don't practice in that area. The other thing you might want to look at, again, both state and federal, I didn't show you this last week for federal, but it works the same, is what's on what's being considered. So if we took a look at proposed rules, we would see, oh, there's something here about NSAIDs under the Gaming Commission. And we also see something called a regulatory agenda. And most agencies will have this, again, both federal and state. And it's 2017, and it is what it sounds like. It's what does that particular agency plan to do this year. And there's a whole bunch of stuff up here. What I've left a lot about horse racing and all sorts of gaming, because that's the jurisdiction of the Gaming Commission. What I had left highlighted was they are also considering adoption of regulations implementing Article 14 having to do with interactive fantasy sports. How many of you are following March Madness and are sports enthusiasts? And how many of you participate in fantasy leagues of one type or another? Anybody? Okay, one or two. So did you remember from, I think it was last year, for a while, a couple of the big ones were declared illegal in New York State. And then that was reversed, and now what's happened is they are now coming under the jurisdiction of the Gaming Commission, and the Gaming Commission will issue regulations, I think basically to tax the proceeds of those. What are they called? What are the companies again? I forget their names. Yeah, FanDuel and what was the other? Yeah. So if they want to have business in New York, they will become subject to these regulations. If this is an area of law that you are interested in, this is one way to follow what's going on for any particular clients, or perhaps hopefully potential clients, is the regulatory agenda. Okay. Any questions? And what I'm showing you here, just a quick Westlaw search in terms of, once again, finding regulations, finding administrative decisions and guidance, and once again, using the all-important that term for regulatory material, the all-important table of contents, to determine what else might be relevant in relevant sections in your areas. Okay. So I'm going to move into the last area of primary sources. We've gone from large to small, medium in the way. So we've got federal, large in terms of amount of materials available, amount of materials to research and find. We've gone from federal to state. And now we go to municipal or really local. And municipal or really local can be a little bit confusing because it kind of falls under both headings of legislative and executive. It falls under executive because essentially the state delegates its authority to localities, municipalities, cities, towns, counties, to say, okay, here are the general rules, here are the state laws. you figure out what day of the week you're going to pick up garbage, and you figure out, what people can put out, and you figure out what the parking rules are, and snow removal, and those day-to-day, very local things. So the state is delegated to the municipalities, and different municipalities have different structures, but they generally fall under the same framework that we've been working with. In other words, there is a document that establishes how the government of the municipality is going to work. You have a charter. So there's the New York City Charter. So that's kind of like the Constitution. What are the different branches of the municipal government? That's established by the charter. What are their roles? What are their powers? What are their responsibilities? Some municipalities will have a legislature. Nassau County has a legislature. Or a city council. New York City has the city council. And they are elected people who sit together as a body and they pass laws. Instead of being called public laws or chapter laws, they are called local laws. And here's where it starts to get a little bit confusing, I think, is that these local laws, through, once again, the force, the magic of codification, wind up in something called an administrative code. Now, it's not administrative regulations agencies the way we've been talking about, but it uses the same darn name, so it can get confusing. So if you're talking about a locality's administrative code, it's probably the laws passed by their legislature. So New York City Council, in Long Beach, I mentioned to you I live in Long Beach, we have a council and they pass laws. Actually, interestingly, in Long Beach, we don't really have an executive. In the very largest of municipalities, like New York City, they do have agencies. So there are actually rules of those municipal agencies. Mention this. Rats. Okay, I have to back up because I forgot to mention something relevant. So we need to go back to New York Administrative Materials a second. Sorry about that. So we talked about finding administrative decisions, and we talked about looking in the web. So here's an example of the New York Department of State. And again, this is just a different agency, but it's an agency, and you'll see they actually do have decisions. And they also have procedures for hearings. And one other useful way to find some of those state agency decisions is good old Google. You can see I just searched New York State Administrative Decisions, and I got a whole bunch of different ones. I might also use the word opinions as an alternative. So we see the Department of State. We see unemployment insurance. So you see the different agencies. This one is Division of Tax and Labor. Moving now to municipalities. So one thing I should mention about New York State is that it's incredibly complex with regard to the municipal jurisdictions. You would have to talk to former Dean, now Professor Lane. That's his area of expertise on how all of that works, because there are a lot of overlapping jurisdictions. So for instance, we are now sitting in the town of Hempstead. We are also sitting in the village of Hempstead, I think. We are also in Nassau County. I live in the city of Long Beach. The city of Long Beach is also in Nassau County, but it is not part of the town of Hempstead. Confused yet? I am, and I live there. So it's difficult to keep track. There are a couple of resources, and these links are on your website. Yes, it is Wikipedia, so I'm not going to cite to it, but I actually find this to be a really good explanation for someone who doesn't understand it much at all, and that's me, of how all of this works and the different types of municipalities and what they all mean and do. For a more official resource. There, again, because the state delegates the authority to municipalities, on the New York State government website, there are local government services. So you can get more information. How do you adopt and amend a county charter? How do you adopt local laws in New York State? And then New York State has something called a local government handbook. Now, I don't know how complex other states are, so for those of you headed out to other states, take a look at your state's website and get to understand the extent to which it is or is not confusing what the local law structure looks like and whether you have something like a local government handbook. So let's take a look at a couple of the jurisdictions to which we currently, as we sit and stand now, are subject. So we are in the town of Hempstead. Give you an idea of what the town actually does, at least in this particular website under Citizen Services. You get an idea of what's going to be covered. So emergency services, water, that's important, right? Public safety, of course, traffic, so that's going to be something covered by the town of Hempstead, highways, special districts, veteran services, sanitation, that's another thing. So all of these areas of our everyday existence are governed by these various local jurisdictions. And again, in New York, depending on which local jurisdiction, might depend on what particular area it has jurisdiction over. So what do these local laws look like? You're typically looking for a town code. So the town of Hempstead will have a town code. The City of Long Beach has city ordinances. So think of administrative code and ordinances. Those are, if you're Googling, which is really probably the best way to find any of these, you'll want to remember to use either term. And these days, as I mentioned, the best place to find it is on the free web. I won't even bother with Lexis and Wessel. I have a few, but finding it isn't easy, and I think there are actually easier to find and use on the web. So, for instance, you can see here what town code looks like. Here's our ever-favorite table of contents. You get a sense of, so here in the code it tells us how to adopt local laws. Lots about taxation and appeals, and so that's even, so an ever-favorite topic around here, parking. We can see what municipal ordinances talk about parking for the town of Hempstead. Okay, likewise, as I mentioned, we are also within Nassau County. So here's the overall website, and here is where you would see, again, the county charter that establishes the government of Nassau County. Think of that as the Constitution. The administrative code is really the legislative, where you find the legislation. And as I mentioned, not too many local jurisdictions have administrative agencies. We'll take a look at New York City in just a moment. That's one example that does, I would imagine. LA probably does. I don't know about Boston. I'd have to check that out. Wouldn't surprise me if they did. So as I mentioned, the county legislature passes laws, and when they are first passed, they are known as local laws, public laws. And on the web, you can see here the New York County legislature, and we see here, we can look at those local laws before they are codified into the administrative code. So in 2017, local law number 1 is to amend the administrative code to reenact the real property tax abatement for senior citizens with eligible property. So since there's local tax payments for Nassau County, there's local laws about tax, not surprisingly. Something about equipment over bridges. So that's what's happened in 2017, and these local laws will, of course, as you can see, amend the administrative code. Taking a look at a larger jurisdiction, as I was mentioning, New York City. If you were to Google New York City Administrative Code, it would eventually lead you here, and what we see again, the charter establishes how the government of New York City, mayor and city council, are going to work. administrative code where you see the laws passed by the city council. And because it is a really very large jurisdiction, there are rules. These are the agency rules. So if we were to take a look at those, let's just go back up here. We see this site is, again, got the charter, it's got the administrative code, and I had scrolled down here so we can see what the rules look like. So we've got the Department of Buildings, we've got all the different agencies of the city, the fire department, tax appeal, Department of Finance. You don't need me to read all of these. The Rent Guidelines Board, that might be interest to some of you who either currently live in one of the boroughs or plan to when you graduate. So these various agencies. So again, the structure is the same. The names can be a little confusing, so try to keep that straight. Okay. The last part of municipal materials are specialized codes. So we've got a lot of codes here to keep track of. We've got the city charter, the constitution, we've got the administrative code, the legislative branch. If it's a big jurisdiction, we've got the rules, the agencies. There are sometimes in jurisdictions building codes and fire codes. And they can be a little tough to find. Some creative Googling will get you there. And there's this company, the International Code Council, that drafts these model codes that some states have adopted, and New York is one of them. And you just have to follow your nose on this. So, of course, I want to be updated. So I went to 2016 and I didn't find very much. So I went back to 2015. Let's try to reload that. Serves me right for being creative. Well, we did see it. I'm not quite sure why this isn't working. Try one more time. Well, I don't know why that's not working, but essentially we would see the building code. Nope. We would see building code, fire code. Let's do it that way. Ha! Doesn't work one way to work the other. So I realize you may not be able to see this around here because the pop-up is pretty small, but this is the residential code, and this is the building code as adopted by New York. This is the existing building code. So there's new buildings and there's existing buildings. So for those of you, I remember from our first class, a number of you were interested in real estate law. You might need to know about these building codes because it has to do with real estate. Again, depending on the area that you practice. An international fire code. Plumbing code. So lots of different codes you have to know. And these are all adopted by New York State. International Mechanical Code. And this is Fuel Gas Code. I don't even know what that's going to cover other than fuel gas. And Energy Conservation Code. So these are all codes adopted by New York. And if you are practicing in that area, you need to be aware and familiar with that. Questions. And last but not least, where to find them is, I mentioned Google. Definitely, and that's what I would do first. If for whatever reason Google doesn't work, there are a couple of sites that publish these codes, and off of the library homepage, if you were to go to topic list, you would get to state and local government, and you would see General Municipal Code and Municode. Now, again, I'm not suggesting you try to remember these. Probably, if you aren't succeeding with Googling Long Beach City Code or whatever town of Hempstead code, you might try a portal like, if you can remember, Find Law or Legal Information Institute or a library in that particular state. So here's what they look like. So the general code, which tends to have more for New York, just find it. New York, and here's that Muni code. You go to library, and then it just lists them alphabetically. Actually by state and then jurisdiction. This one tends not to have quite as much for New York, but I think it does better for other states. And last but not least, again, if you are practicing in this local area, read your local newspaper. Because that's or keep alerts going or RSS feeds or however, subscribe to their Facebook feed, whatever, probably all of the above will work for you. Okay. Questions? So what we are going to do is finish up the workshop from last week. Most of you finished all of the questions, and then when I said stop, you got to the stop here point. So to hopefully make it a little easier for you, what I have done on today's workshop is I have reproduced those questions. So you want to pull that out, but I will ask you to fill out the answers on this new one. It's the same questions. The first question, though, refers you back to last week's. And the first question asks you basically just to look at the search results and to see if there are any New York State regulations. So if you cannot find your workshop from last week, then just start with question 1 on either New York State regulations on air pollution or find another topic that interests you. Yeah. And if you're confused by any of that, I'll be wandering around and I will pause. Reminded me because he did a search in the NYCRR and he came up with an executive order. And what he reminded me is that I neglected to mention that executive orders, like other administrative materials, appear in the registers and the administrative code. So executive orders will first appear in the Federal Register and then get transferred to the CFR, Title III, if anybody's really that interested. And similarly, state executive orders. We didn't really discuss it explicitly, but governors issue executive orders just like presidents. We see here on the New York State Gov website, actually the governor.gov website, we see executive orders. So here we see executive orders of Governor Cuomo. And they also wind up they get published in the New York Register and then wind up in the NYCRR, not in Title III. I think executive is Title IX, but don't quote me on that. It is. And we can see also this is the NYCRR on the web, not Lexis or Westlaw. It doesn't have the nice features of citing references and notes of decisions. So again, it's not our BFF friend annotated code, but it is there for free nonetheless. And we see it's actually provided by a name we know and some of us love. We actually might have noticed that with regard to cases. Westlaw actually provides a free source for searching cases as it does for the NYCRR. So again, executive materials, like other administrative materials, appear in similar resources. Any questions? Okay. So we are now, at long last, finishing up with primary sources, and we are now going to look at practice materials. As you may or may not remember, we talked a little bit about practice materials when we talked about secondary sources. In fact, practice materials was kind of its own category as type of source, which is somewhat inaccurate, but it is not a primary source, and it is materials to help us find the law, to help us understand the law, and help us practice the law, not surprisingly, by its name. And in a way, because it really is a secondary source, we've kind of come full circle around. And the reason why we don't go into much detail about practice materials when we first talk about secondary sources in the beginning of the semester is that one of the aspects of some practice materials is that they pull together or reference many of the primary sources that we now have come to understand, know, and possibly even love. In fact, we've encountered a couple of these already when we started way back when. So again, I kind of like stories that come full circle. So here's our favorite search, liability HMO. And we take a look at secondary sources, and some of you, when we did our very first workshop, came up with, and of course we see all the different types of jurisprudence we now know is encyclopedia, this New York Med Mal we now know is going to be more of a treatise, ALR we know is kind of its own thing, and here we come up with something called cause of action. We'll look at in a moment, but what a couple of you, I should say, had seen. Where it goes. A couple of you came across American jurisprudence proof of facts. Now, it's American jurisprudence, so it sounds like AMJUR, it sounds like an encyclopedia. It's by the same folks and under the same topic, and it really is a secondary source. It helps us find, understand, gives the terminology, give us primary source references, all the good stuff that we have been talking about for the last couple of months. But it does, my classic late night TV show, but wait, there's more, and there is definitely more here. So in proof of facts, in addition to all that great stuff that secondary source does, it will also give us practice tips. So it gives us the theories, and we had talked about this when we talked about secondary sources. So it actually gives us some ideas for how we might represent our clients, theories for health maintenance, organization, liability. It talks about damages. What kind of damages might we want to talk about? It talks about elements of proof. Again, getting far more specific from a practice-oriented perspective. If we're bringing this to court, what are the elements of proof? And here's where it really gets into what is considered practice materials, and that are actual samples of what you would use as practicing attorneys. So you might use, if we get to litigation, you might use interrogatories. So look, we have interrogatories from the plaintiff. So let's click on that so you can see what that looks like. So these interrogatories are designed, and so it even gives you fills in the plaintiff means name and defendant, gives you all what an interrogatory would actually look like. Identify yourself, giving your full name, residence, identify persons. What an interrogatory would look like. So proof of facts is one of these practice-oriented materials. I wanted to show you a couple other features of proof of facts, and then we'll look at causes of action, which is rather similar. You actually have testimony. So if you wind up in court, here is questions you might have prepared for the plaintiff. Back. So, testimony of an expert, testimony of a director of an HMO. So very specific, obviously. previously, right? These are questions for you might want to ask in litigation for these particular people in this particular area of law. So really, I think potentially really helpful how-to. If you wanted to try to prove bad faith by the HMO. So even starting out in your research, this is giving you ideas because we're learning that this ERISA preemption thing may be a problem. But maybe if we can show bad faith, so if you are reading through this and thinking and being open-minded, you can get ideas on how, okay, maybe you've done your research and too bad we might be preempted, but maybe not if we can show these other theories or prove these other theories. So one type of practice material, and as I mentioned, causes of action are quite similar. And I have been told by former students who come back and practicing that, oh, I can't tell you how many times proof of facts has helped me because I've looked it up and I found something really useful. So this is something that practicing attorneys have found, do use and do find valuable. So here's cause of action are specific for under state tort law. So again, we get the sense perhaps ERISA preempts this, but cause of action gives us suggestions about how we might find direct liability. Now we've kind of figured out vicarious liability doesn't apply in our situation, so we're not trying to hold the physician liable. Here are defenses. Obviously you might be defending the HMO. And we have the whole section here on practice and procedure. So what's the proof? Again, relief. Practice checklists. Checklists are hugely useful. Litigation, but I think also in transactional practice as well. Just people, experts in this field who know what the different aspects in practicing in this area are important. So what information might you want from, make sure to get from the plaintiff, from the defendant? Checklists on discovery. A sample complaint. You're in litigation, you're representing our client, the plaintiff. Here's a draft complaint, not just a generic one, but one specific to a state cause of action with regard to HMO tort liability. So this is one type of practice material. I like to point out these particular titles because I've said I've spoken to attorneys who find them very useful. Another type of practice material secondary source are loose links. Again, mentioned a couple of times when we talked about secondary sources, and I kept on promising you we'll talk about that later in the semester. Well, here we are. And loose links are that type of secondary source / practice material that pulls everything together. So you will have that good old secondary source explanation, reference to primary sources. You might have some of these checklists. You might have some forms like the sample complaint or other forms. And again, these loose leaves can be, if you are in the litigating end, they are also very useful if you're on the transactional end, if you're drafting documents, if you're putting together a merger, if you're helping a client buy or sell a business or form a business. They're essentially what I like to think of as one-stop shopping. How to probably where you would fit this in terms where you would fit loose leaves and in your research strategy, I would say later on in the process, just as we're talking about it later on in the semester. Not necessarily like proof of facts, causes of action, as we saw way back when we talk about secondary sources, and we see again today, they might be useful starting out. You might want to come back to them later when you're starting to draft your complaint and think about interrogatories and all of that. But they're useful in both. Strictly loose leaves probably are more useful later on because they're more useful as you get to understand an area better, you have a better sense of what you might want to be researching. They're somewhat complex to use. They're somewhat complex to use in print or online. As you see, I have a couple print, which I'll pass along in a moment. How do you find them? Well, like any secondary source, all the strategies we talked about, whether it's just Googling and getting references. Remember our, let's go back here to our research guides. You'll find a lot of good references, just as we would treatises. You'll find a lot of good references to loose leaves on research guides. Now, you won't necessarily see them referred to as loose leaf. You'll know they're loose leaf when you get when you get references within a title to a lot of different types of documents, whether it's explanations or analysis, or you might get references, and you get that, which is your typical secondary source, and you get references to statute sections or code or administrative code sections, regulations that we just talked about, and references to cases. Sometimes they'll pull it all together all in one. And that's why attorneys love loose leaves so much, because once they get to know an area, they get everything they need in one place, in one set. These days, because it's less of a set of books and more online, a lot of times that will be a database, which we'll look at in a moment. Okay, so we've talked, why do you care? One-stop shopping pulls a lot of things together: practice materials, primary sources, secondary source explanation. How do you find it? As I mentioned, research guides. If you're working in a larger organization and you've got colleagues who've been practicing in that area for a while, they're probably going to have their favorite. Here today, but if you're a tax practitioner, they're going to either like RIA or CCH. Intellectual property, NIMR, right? NIMR is one of the title for intellectual property copyright type areas. Your favorite reference librarians is kind of what we do for a living. So there are different areas. If you have a New York practice section, I'm going to send you to Weinstein, Korn & Miller, which is the loose leaf for New York practice. There's a New York mortgage loose leaf. All sorts of loose leaves on a whole variety of topics that people who are either practicing in the area or help people find resources for a living are going to know about. You will find these resources, you will find loose leaves online. You will find NIMR on Lexis. You'll find lots of Weinstein, Korn & Miller is also on Lexis. More and more loose leaves are going online, and more libraries like Hofstra and other libraries, law libraries across the country, are relying on loose leaves online. The reason for that, multiple reasons for that. NIMR, for instance, and I'll pass this around. I am looking at, I pulled up volumes 5 and 6. There are probably about 5 more volumes. The way loose leaves in print work is, I think I might have mentioned this already, is basically the library gets updates, and whatever, we have staff who pull out the old pages and put in the new. As you can imagine, this takes a lot of staff time. These loose leaves are extraordinarily expensive. I think NIMR definitely costs in the thousands, and the first number is not a 1. So $3,000, $5,000 is not unheard of for an annual subscription. And that's a lot of money. And as you can imagine, from a law practice perspective, that's a lot of money. So I'll pass these around. So what's happening as these loose leaves appear online, so many people prefer researching online. It's far more convenient, right? You can research at 2 a.m. in your pajamas. So a lot of libraries, us included, are no longer getting the print. NIMR we do get, but as you can see, but a lot of loose leaves we no longer get. And I think that's true in practice as well. More and more firms, corporations, law, accounting, whatever, are relying on loose leaves online. That's good because it's more convenient and people like to be able to do keyword searching. It's not so good because loose leaves are so complex. Like I said, they've got lots of different parts to them. It can get very confusing to do to search online and pull out just a single section of a loose leaf in your results without the full context. I mean, right? We could search all of secondary sources and we would get one section in NIMR or one section in any other loose leaf without really understanding. It doesn't tell us this is a loose leaf. So again, this is where your table of contents becomes key when you're doing research, secondary research on Lexis and Westlaw, as well, and the background to that, of course, being bibliographic awareness. Take a look at what that section is, what it's a part of, what whole set is it a part of, what subsection or chapter is it a part of. Am I looking at a form or am I looking at an explanation? Big difference, right? I mean, you'd think you'd see it right away, but not necessarily if the form gives you a couple of paragraphs of explanation. If you are in a place that has print, most loose leafs will have a how to use tab, and that's worth the 10 minutes that it will take you to read it, because as I said, some loose leaves can be pretty complex. Back in the day when it wasn't all online, there were all different segments. So if you were in the tax area, you would definitely want to use the how to use section, because there would be the Internal Revenue Code, there'd be the Internal Revenue Regulations, there'd be all the IRS publications, there would be forms, there would be updating volumes. So you'd want to figure out how all that fit together. Okay, so having exhorted you to look at table of contents and be bibliographic aware, let's take a look at what some loose leaves would look like online. So let's go back here to Lexis. And let's do our favorite search. And so, of course, find them in secondary sources. And again, later on in my research process, when I know a little bit about it and I might want some practice guidance, what I might want to do here is select multiple. And I might want to say, okay, I want to take a look at treatises, but I also want to take a look at practice guides, because I'm not sure which one it's going to fall under. So here we have, and we've looked at this before, personal injury, actions, defenses, damages. And this is from, that's actually the name. So let's take a look. So we're looking, again, so the name of the whole treatise, personal injury, actions, defenses, damages. Chapter 4, managed healthcare organizations. So if we take a look at the table of contents, so what we see actually, again, our background, understanding the whole industry, that could be useful to understand negligence and fiduciary and all these questions that we've kind of come up and not talked about particularly in depth. We were looking at section 94.03. Look at that, 94.04 has action based on denial of treatment. And here we see defenses. So even if we are the plaintiff, we want to know what the defenses, the other side might come up with defenses. Damages, what kind of damages might we want to think about? And again, forms. So cause of action, defense, pleading, so our complaint, other forms. So this is a loose leaf that will pull together, again, those practice type materials as well as a lot of what seems to be promising, useful explanation. Give you a sense of how loose leaves work online and in print. The reason why loose leaves became so popular in print before everything went online is, in addition to having everything in one place, they were updated a lot more frequently. They were updated more than just annually. Again, those pages would get pulled out and put in. So here, again, online, just as a reminder, we can take a look at the publication information and see how up-to-date this is. We can also take a look at the What's New, which, again, gives you a sense of what makes a loose leaf a little bit different. And this publication update tells us the latest chapters as of February 2017, right? Pretty up-to-date. So here's the highlights of the latest update. Now, there's no reason why you would, typical reason why you'd really want to look at this. I'm just showing you this as an illustration of how loose leaves work. And if you are researching on Lexis and Westlaw, a couple things you want to keep in mind, as is true with many secondary sources, is these can be really expensive if they are out of your plan. So once again, as we learned in the video, Lexis should give you a pop-up, Westlaw should give you a pop-up if it is out of your plan. If for whatever reason you're in a matter and you really need it, you might want to check with somebody, the librarian or the managing partner or somebody who deals with this stuff to say, hey, this is going to be really useful. Obviously, if we have it in print, you're welcome to come here to use it. So these tend to be the really super expensive materials, something like NIMR, especially because everybody thinks NIMR is so wonderful. Of course, Lexis is going to charge a lot of money for it out of plan. But even something like this, personal injury actions, can tend to get very pricey. Also, on Lexis and Westlaw, there are publishers that have become favorites of attorneys. So a lot of attorneys, slightly older than you all, will, if you say Matthew Bender, they'll know who you're talking about because those are the great New York, a lot of New York loose leaves that a lot of attorneys really use a lot, were published by Matthew Bender. Matthew Bender since been bought out by Lexis, so you'll find some Matthew Bender treatises on Lexis. And that's why it's still kind of good to know this old stuff, because if you're looking at a treatise and someone tells you, oh, go look at Matthew Bender, you're thinking, who's Matthew Bender? If you know to look on Lexis, you'll hopefully be able to find some good ones. Weinstein, Korn, and Miller is another one. That's the New York practice treatise. Weinstein, Korn, and Miller are actually the authors, but New York attorneys refer to it as Weinstein, Korn, and Miller, sometimes just WKM, which doesn't help you all starting out if you're not familiar with it, but, as people get familiar with it, they start to use shorthand. Okay, so that's loose leaves if you're looking on Lexis, on Westlaw, and of course, as on both services, if you have a name like NIMR on Lexis, if you happen to know Patry on Westlaw, since if you only have Westlaw, you're not going to get NIMR. So if you happen to remember, Patry's after NIMR, Patry's one of the leading copyright treatises and loose leaves. If, however, you don't have a particular name in mind, or you haven't browsed, and again, you can browse through secondary sources or your topical practice area or topical area of law, and as usual, we can do our search. And yes, I could have limited ahead of time and probably should have, whichever way. And again, remember, a few people were confused. I remember Westlaw calls it texts and treatises, but you also find encyclopedias here because that's the text part of texts and treatises, so don't assume everything here is a treatise. Obviously, the New York State Bar Journal isn't a treatise. It's a periodical. It's actually it's more like it's the State Bar Journal's publication, I think, monthly, but it has substantive articles, as you can see. So if we know we want more in-depth explanation, it's later on in our research process, we might want to limit to texts and treatises. And notice listed here again because these publishers, Westlaw and Lexis, understand that practicing attorneys are used to these names. Notice Walters Kluwer in parentheses CCH. CCH was bought out by Walters Kluwer. CCH is and any tax attorney will know CCH. Actually, securities attorneys will know CCH because that's another very well-respected, popular title. They've been bought out, so now they're trying to rebrand themselves as Walters Kluwer, but they understand that so many attorneys know CCH that they're not going to give up that name quite yet. But we're not going to worry about CCH for the moment. We'll be looking at CCH in a couple of minutes, but not on Westlaw. So we limited to text and treatises if we know that's what we want. Later on, as I said, perhaps later on in our process. So again, so here we have, and I chose this one again because I know it's a loose leaf and a treatise. And loose leaves are one type of treatise. And again, don't get at all caught up in any of the, how is this defined? Understand the basic functionality of a treatise is going to be far more in-depth than an encyclopedia, which is going to be different than a law review or journal like a New York Bar Journal. And understand why you might want to look at one as opposed to another. So interestingly, this particular treatise / loose leaf gives us a different view of just other resources to check that are available, of course, on Westlaw. So again, more practice-oriented, trial strategy. Again, we have reference to forms, another Amjur set, pleading, practice, and forms. Or excuse me, pleading and practice forms, because the whole set is forms, and we'll be looking at forms next week in more detail. And then some classic. But as so here's our table of contents, and once again, because all we're getting is this random section, right? 62:14, corporate negligence, apparent reply to agency and respondent spirit. Does this have anything to do with us? Well, we might want to read through, but we might also put it in context. So litigating tort cases, okay, that is relevant, but we're actually in Chapter 62, HMO litigation. Without looking at that, and that isn't even that clear up here, at least in my opinion, but looking over here at the table of contents, I realized, okay, that is relevant to what I care about. And then I can see, again, the different aspects of the loose leaf of the treatise. So it gives me references to different acts, types of claims, checklists. Again, let's take a look just so you can see what checklists look like. You kind of know what checklists look like, I understand, but this particular one. So arguments to consider, or and potential themes to consider to include. So again, helping you make the case for your client or determine whether your client even has a case. So here are things we haven't encountered. HMO lawyers were involved in the approval process. That's something to consider. Who knew? Again, all these useful types of resources we haven't really encountered. Sources of proof. That is here. And illustrative and forms, again. We'll look at forms in more detail next time, as I said. So what's sources of proof? Sources of proof might include HMO contracts. So how you might want to do some investigation to figure out, once again, whether your client. So we had talked about this, remember, when we did our issue spotting. What's in the contract? That was a question we needed to investigate further. Certificates of coverage, coverage booklets, ERISA plan or lack thereof, prior versions, relevant provider directories. And again, you determine, does this apply for my client's issue? Personnel, persons involved in the treatment of claim plaintiff and or the claims process. So personnel of the people deciding whether our client got treatment or didn't get treatment as it turned out. So things that, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have thought of all these. Some of them don't apply, but some of them would be great to have been highlighted for us. Okay, so that's practice materials loosely. Lexis Westlaw, any questions? So let's talk about other databases where we will find what used to be known as loose leaves. Admittedly, it's somewhat an old-fashioned term because we're not talking about the binders anymore because we're looking online, but that's still how they get referred to, so it's still useful to know about. And as we talked about when we talked about secondary sources in terms of cost-efficient searching, again, depending on where you are working, you may be working in an institution that specializes in an area that subscribes to a database other than Lexis or Westlaw that may be flat fee, and many are. So we talked about how Hein Online is flat fee. You actually all did your best to find CCH and Teleconnect. So that's one we will take a look at. And again, CCH is rebranding itself into Wolters Kluwer. So when we finally get on there, you'll actually see Wolters Kluwer is more prominent than CCH, although we do see it still here. CCH is also, in Teleconnect, what we're looking at now, is also migrating to a new platform. This is something you're going to need to get used to doing online research. Back when we did books, books are pretty much books. They have indexes, they have table of contents, they have sections and print. That is not true necessarily if they are going to call themselves Cheetah. And just so you can see just how different it is. And what Wolters Kluwer is doing is it's rolling out Cheetah, this new platform, gradually. So some databases, some CCH and Teleconnect databases are here now, and some aren't here now. So probably we here at the Hofstra Law Library will migrate over to Cheetah, but we will wait until they're complete because it just drives too many people too crazy to try to do it on both and figure out which one is it on Teleconnect, is it on Cheetah. But these are all challenges that, as practicing attorneys, you will encounter as you use these online databases. So here we're back at Teleconnect. As I said, we will stay here. And you can see CCH is a database that covers a whole lot of different topics. We'll look at a single topic database in just a moment. So it ranges from tax. CCH certainly is well known in tax, as I mentioned, also securities. So securities state, securities federal, and basically what CCH did is it took all its different loose leafs that it had published under different titles and charged tons and tons of money for each, and it dumped all of that into this single database called Teleconnect, soon to be called Cheetah. So we might be interested in health for our client, and hint, hint, you might be interested in food, drugs, and devices for your assignment coming up, which we'll talk about at the end of class. So let's take a look at, and let's search HMO so you can see what CCH looks like. And one of the things I don't like about Teleconnect are these pop-ups that get in the way. So just close them out as they pop up. So we can see the different parts of the loose leaf. And again, I still find this a little bit confusing because it's out of context. But what they've tried to do here is give us a little bit of context. So we have the explanations, although we don't really see explanation of what area. I mean, health and HMO is pretty broad, right? You see the law. So that was one thing about loose leaves. It brings everything together. So you don't have to go find the actual text of the laws, although you have to narrow down. So here's New York, 4403, actually in the area we were looking at, and regulations. So all the types of materials we're talking about: cases, news. So what's tools? So these tools are going to be practice tools are going to be very different depending on the area. These annotations also are more like explanations. Agency materials. So I've been mentioning to a number of you as we're doing the workshop that agency decisions are hard to find. Lexis and Westlaw are really sketchy in terms of their coverage, so you might want to go to the agency website. The nice thing about time is money in the law, and so the nice thing about these loose leaves is it brings it all together. So, excuse me, here are agency materials under our CCH title. Legislative history, legislative documents. So you get the idea. But once again, these are all out of context. So if we were going to look at a particular explanation, again, I would want to take a look at the context, at the table of contents, and I would see this is actually from the Med Guide, and it talks about Medicare, so that isn't relevant for us. And what CCH does, which honestly is a little bit confusing, is that you can get to the table of contents here on the side. So it takes a little hunting and pecking on CCH to put it in context, but don't let that deter you, because it really is, when you're dealing with these loose leaf materials online, it really is necessary. And here you can limit. So this document path would be another way to look at the table of contents. And I know you probably can't read that small print, especially in the back, but that again gives you the context of where we are. So we're in the Medicare and Medicaid guide, and we're in archive rulings. So I would see that and I would say, no, it doesn't apply to us, and I would see what else. Or I might try to limit otherwise. Probably before my search, limit which topics. So here we've searched the whole healthcare compliance and reimbursement. I might want to expand that out and say, okay, I want to search maybe human resources or healthcare compliance portfolio, whatever sounds like it's going to be most relevant. So that's CCH, just to give you a quick look at what, so as you can see, I don't see health here. So here's an example where Cheetah wouldn't, the new platform wouldn't help us a great deal. So just so you can see that, so that's another other platform of CCH. Another database, if you are in the tax area, would be RIA. And again, here on the library homepage is not. We have a direct link to CCH here. For subject specific, I need to go to our subject or topic list. RIA. It's going to come up. And again, you want to find out, again, probably if you're working for a larger organization, because these are expensive, you want to find out if your organization subscribes to a specialized database, because then you don't have to worry about the fees and contracts and whatnot of Lexis and Westlaw. And by the way, I'm not leaving Bloomberg out. I know how much you all love Bloomberg, so you're really missing it. But I'm not leaving it out because it doesn't have these materials. I'm saving it for next week. So you're going can see a very different organization. Again, this is probably going to be easier to understand because it is just a single topic, tax, although it covers a wide range, federal, state tax, state pension. But you see they divided up editorial materials, so what it sounds like, well, maybe not what it sounds like, the explanations, you see treatises, so sort of the secondary sources as opposed to primary sources, and news. And as I have been saying a whole lot, oh, I didn't select search, shame on me. So let's just I might want to look at federal tax coordinator analysis. I don't really want to check this quite yet. So you can just see what RIA looks like. See, again, they agree with me that contents are important, so you again can see the context of your section. Any questions on loose leaves practice materials? Okay. Then let's spend the rest of